Before dawn on the edge of the Pine Barrens, Eli Carter, a homeless 12-year-old, freezes behind a thicket as two men drag an unconscious stranger toward a freshly dug pit. When the fog thins, Eli recognizes the face. Silas Rourke, the boss people in town only whisper about. One man chuckles, "Hurry. His people won't get here in time." Eli's blood turns cold because that only makes sense if someone had compromised the rescue from the inside. A shovel hits wet earth thump, thump, like a countdown. Silas twitches. Steel gray eyes crack open and lock onto Eli's hiding place, half command, half plea. "Don't let me die here. No phone. No adults. Just a stone by a pine and a choice." Eli throws the stone. The men spin around. He lunges, drags Silas back from the edge, and runs. Minutes later, he stumbles onto the road, waving down cars that blaze past until a dark SUV brakes hard. The window drops. The driver's stare isn't panicked. It's controlled. Eli gasps. They're burying Silas Rourke alive. And the driver's expression shifts like he's just realized the hunt has begun. Do you feel how tense this opening is? Give us a like, please. Share it with anyone who lives for breath-stealing plot twists. And subscribe to the channel so you won't miss the next episode. Miles Keene didn't need to ask another question to know this wasn't the prank of a panicked child. The instant the window slid down, he'd already seen the signs an ordinary person would miss. Wet mud clinging from Eli's pant cuffs all the way to his knees. A thin scrape on his wrist like he'd just been dragged across bark. And that very particular look street kids carry, scared and stubborn at the same time. As if he wasn't believed right now, he'd sprint straight into death on his own. Eli hadn't even caught his breath before he started stammering and pointing into the fog. And Miles reached for the seatbelt. Not rough, but decisive, like an order that didn't need words. "Sit still. Point the way." He didn't ask why the boy was there. He didn't ask whether he was telling the truth. He just did what he always did when Silas slipped beyond his control. He pressed a concealed button beneath the dashboard. The vehicle screen made no sound, but a small icon lit up, signaling that a silent communication channel was open. No ringing, no call, only short, encrypted pulses that an outsider would mistake for a car running normally. Miles turned the wheel. The SUV left the empty road, rolled over gravel, and pushed into a dark trail like the mouth of a cave, where the headlights were shattered by pine branches into pale, broken pieces of light. Eli held his breath, pointing again and again, left, right, as if he were running the route he'd just run on exhausted legs. Miles listened to everything with his ears, and read everything with his eyes. The forest air smelled like freshly turned earth. That damp, heavy smell anyone who's ever dug a hole never confuses. He eased off the gas at the right moment so the tires wouldn't squeal, so the dry leaves wouldn't crack too loudly beneath the wheels. At a bend, Eli suddenly lurched forward, his voice breaking with fear. There. Miles switched off the headlights, leaving only a dim strip of light, just enough to see the ground. Then opened the door and stepped out like a shadow. He signaled Eli to stay put in the SUV. Eli tried to argue, but Miles's look made him swallow the words. It wasn't a vicious look. It was the look of someone who'd lived long enough to understand that sometimes life is only one extra step away from death. Miles moved along the direction Eli had indicated, counting his own breaths to keep himself steady, and then he saw Silas. There was no dramatic spectacle, just a heavy body lying on its side at the edge of a pit, a dark coat soaked with mud, a hand still marked by rope. Miles dropped to his knees, set 2 fingers on Silas's wrist. A pulse, very faint, but there. He didn't let his face change, because he knew if Eli saw panic, the boy would break. He spoke in clipped, clean sentences. "Good. You did the right thing." Then he worked like a machine trained for this his whole life. A quick assessment, cutting the bindings, dragging Silas back from the crumbling edge just far enough to be safe. No yanking, no sudden shock to a body that had already been pushed too far. On Silas's wrist, the luxury watch was still there. But what made Miles's spine go cold was something else. The concealed tracking device he'd once attached to Silas with his own hands was gone. Not smashed, not dropped during a struggle. It had been removed cleanly, correctly, at the right point, like someone who knew exactly what they were doing. Miles didn't say it out loud, but inside his head, a door slammed shut. This wasn't a random ambush anymore. This was a planned clearing of the path, and whoever did the clearing had the authority to touch what no one was allowed to touch. An insider. Just one word. And it was enough to turn the entire Rourke security system into a joke if it was handled wrong. Miles lifted a hand to his ear, brushing the invisible earpiece, and sent a short signal through the silent channel. No names, no location, only a coded command. Bring the medical team, but don't turn on the sirens. Lock down the routes, but don't create chaos. And most of all, no one was to know where Silas was except the people Miles chose. Eli climbed out of the SUV, legs shaking, but he forced his spine straight, as if he was afraid of being thrown out. He looked at Silas, then at Miles, his lips pressed tight. Is he going to live? Miles didn't promise what he couldn't be sure of, but he also wouldn't let the boy sink into darkness. If you hadn't thrown that rock, he wouldn't have had a chance. You pulled him back. Eli let out a breath like he'd finally released a stone lodged in his throat. Right then, a gust swept through, pushing the fog aside, and Miles saw what made the hair rise along his neck. At the very edge of the dim light, on the wet earth beside a pine stump, there was a third shoe print. Fresh, sharp, new. It didn't belong to Eli. It didn't belong to the two men Eli described as the ones who dug the pit, because the tread grooves were completely different. That print pointed toward the pit, as if someone had stood there watching for a long time, then turned away lightly, unhurried, not panicked. Miles lifted his head on instinct, eyes cutting through the black between the trunks. No one, only the forest and the silence. But he knew this feeling, the feeling of being watched from somewhere he couldn't see. He crouched, pressed his palm to the shoe print for a brief moment, as if he could memorize its shape into his skin, then rose and covered Eli with his body by reflex. When the sound of distant vehicles began to drift closer, Miles didn't relax at all. He only stared into the darkness ahead and thought one thing. The third person had been here. That person knew Silas was still alive. And if Miles had been one beat slower, the hunt that had begun out on the road might have begun right here in the woods. The steel gate slid aside without a squeal, only a faint tremor traveling through the pavement, as if this entire place had been built to swallow sound whole. Miles drove through the narrow entrance, the headlights long since off, relying only on the dim glow of recessed guidance lights, just enough to keep the tires from biting into loose stone. Eli sat curled up in the back seat, knees drawn tight, the coat he'd borrowed from Miles, still carrying the smell of forest wind. His hands kept tightening, then releasing, as if he needed the motion to remind himself he was still alive. Silas lay in front, head slightly tilted, his face cut out of the darkness by the dashboard light, still cold as stone even though his breathing had steadied. Miles didn't say another word. He just kept both hands on the wheel as if he were holding the whole world from falling. When the SUV stopped inside a sealed garage, the automatic door closed the moment the rear of the vehicle cleared it, and Eli felt as if he'd just been shut inside a box with no way out. Then the door into the house swung open, and Harper Lane Rourke stepped out, not running, not panicking, only moving straight ahead like someone who'd been standing there a long time and was simply waiting for the exact second to arrive. She wore a plain black coat, her hair tied back neatly, her face free of heavy makeup. Yet her eyes were so sharp that Eli felt his heart draw tight. Harper didn't rush in to wrap her arms around Silas. She didn't break into sobs. She didn't say his name in a shattered voice. She scanned her unconscious husband the way a doctor scans a wound that needs to be managed, then turned directly to Miles. Who knew the schedule? The question fell like a blade. Miles answered briefly, without explanations. The people with authority to issue the route, a very small group. Harper nodded. She didn't ask why Silas was there. She didn't ask what had happened in the woods, as if every story was meaningless until she knew who had opened the door for the enemy. She glanced at Eli once, only once, but Eli felt as though she saw through the mud and torn clothes and straight into everything he'd had to survive. Get him inside. Call the family doctor. No sirens. No media. Harper turned toward a man standing half hidden in shadow, signaled with a small nod, and the house began to move like a disciplined body. No shouting, no chaos, only quick footsteps and doors opening at the right moments. Eli stayed where he was, stranded among clean-dressed people and cold walls. He knew he should disappear, because places like this weren't meant for him. He took one step backward toward the garage door, eyes already searching for an escape, when another woman appeared, tall, shoulders square, expression blank, a small earpiece in her ear like Miles's. She looked at Eli the way you look at an object that hasn't been cleared. "This child doesn't come with us," she said, voice flat. "He could be bait. He could have a tracking device. He could be how they lead us back here." Miles lifted a hand in front of Eli on instinct, a light shield, but Harper spoke first, still ice cold, and that made her even more frightening. "Your name," the woman answered at once. "Tessa Vaughn." Harper stepped closer, placing herself between Eli and Tessa like an invisible boundary. "Tessa, you have the right to be suspicious. You don't have the right to make a child afraid." Tessa's brow tightened. "You're protecting a risk." Harper didn't hold Tessa's gaze for long. She looked at Eli. "What's your name?" Eli lost a beat before he could speak. "Eli." Harper nodded, as if writing the name into a ledger inside her mind. "Eli, you saved my husband. You also just stepped into a war you don't belong to. And because you don't belong, you're easier to kill out there." Eli wanted to say he didn't need anyone to save him, that he'd survived on his own, but his throat closed. Tessa still wouldn't let go. What if he's the key they're using to open the door into this house? Harper turned to Tessa, and this time her eyes were as bright and hard as headlights in the dark. "Outside is the trap. If they wanted the boy gone, they'd do it the moment he stepped outside the gate. If they wanted to track us, they'd have been tracking us since the woods. You won't push him back out there and turn us into the ones who helped them finish burying him alive a second time." No one spoke for a beat. Eli could hear his own heart, and for the first time that night, he wasn't sure whether he was afraid of Harper or holding on to her. Harper signaled for a house staff member to bring warm water, clean towels, and an old pair of shoes that fit. She didn't perform pity. She simply acted as if it was what had to be done. "Keep the boy in the room beside the living room. Don't lock it like a prison. But don't let him go alone." Tessa started to object, then looked at Miles, then looked at Harper's eyes, and finally only set her jaw, swallowing a sentence she didn't say. Miles lowered his voice to Harper as they moved down the hall. "I saw a third shoe print. Someone was watching." Harper didn't slow down, only gave a reply that sounded like it had been waiting. "Then we've got one more who needs to show their face." When Silas was placed on the bed in the inner room, the doctor checked him quickly. A small light sweeping across his pupils, fingers finding his pulse, everything done in secrecy, like a private truth. Eli stood at the threshold of the living room, a cup of water in his hands, eyes fixed on the hallway where Silas lay, feeling as if he were standing between two worlds. Then, from inside the room, a very soft sound rose, like a breath being pulled back. Harper turned instantly. Miles did too. The door eased open, and Silas, still weak, still pale, lifted his eyes, opening them just enough, sharp enough to cut through every doubt. That gaze found Eli the way it found an anchor. Silas didn't call his name. He didn't ask. He didn't thank him. He said only one sentence, rough and heavy as a verdict. "Stay where I can see you." The safe house settled back into a silence like a watch ticking inside a thick casing. Every sound swallowed the moment it touched the walls. Eli sat on the edge of the sofa, the water in his cup already cold, his legs still trembling, yet he forced his face into calm, as if that could make him feel less out of place. Harper stood lightly braced against the doorway that opened to the hall. One arm folded across her chest, the other hand holding her phone without pressing a thing, only waiting. Tessa stood slightly behind her, eyes never leaving Eli, as if she were recording every blink into an invisible report. Miles barely moved at all. Back straight, shoulders low, the stance of someone used to guarding a name that wasn't allowed to fall. From the inner room came the doctor's quiet voice. Then it stopped. A stretch of silence lasted just long enough for Eli to realize the most frightening thing here wasn't guns or bodyguards. It was absolute control. The door to Silas's room opened a hand's width, and very light but decisive footsteps sounded, as if a man had stepped out of a fever dream without losing an ounce of power. After the doctor administered an emergency IV, Silas Rourke appeared in the doorway. Though pale and leaning against the frame, his steel-gray gaze was as sharp as ever. He didn't ask who did it. He didn't slam a fist on the table. He didn't roar for the traitor. He only swept his eyes across them, slow enough that each person was forced to stand a little straighter, then stopped on Eli for one beat longer. Eli clenched the cup without meaning to, bracing for an accusation or a thank you. Neither came. Silas only turned to Miles. "Report." One word. Miles answered at once, clean and spare. "Silas is alive. The tracking device was removed clean." I saw a third shoe print at the edge of the pit. Someone watched, then pulled back. Silas nodded, as if confirming something he'd known before he even opened his eyes. "Tessa," he called. Tessa answered immediately, not daring to be slow. "Here." Silas looked at her, his tone unchanged. "Lock every internal channel. Anyone who contacts outside procedure, log it. No warnings. Just log it." Tessa swallowed once, but she still answered. "Understood." The whole room seemed to hold its breath at the same time, because everyone understood. This wasn't the anger of a man who'd just escaped death. This was the cold focus of a boss switching into hunting mode. Harper stepped forward one pace, level with Silas, her voice not shaking, not soft. "You need rest." Silas didn't look at her right away. He stared into the darkness beyond the window, where the trees were nothing but shadows. When he spoke again, his voice was rough but steady. "I rest when the person who flipped the switch to cut off rescue shows their face." Harper didn't argue with emotion. She went straight for what mattered. "We're talking about the truth, but you don't pull Eli into blood. Do you hear me?" Tessa's mouth twitched, like she wanted to say that was impossible in their world. But Harper didn't look at her. Harper looked at Silas. She didn't plead. She laid down a rule. Silas went quiet for a beat, long enough for Eli to think he'd give a thin smile or brush it aside. But then Silas turned back to Harper, his eyes not softer, only deeper, as if he were weighing a child's life on the same scale as his own honor. "I don't need blood," Silas said, each word dropping slow and heavy. "I need the truth." It wasn't a warm promise. It was a principle. It was frightening in a clean way, because it meant anyone standing between him and the truth would be crushed by things they couldn't fight. Money, records, evidence, loyalty stripped bare. Eli looked at Harper, then at Silas, and for the first time he understood why people only dared to say Silas's name in a whisper. Not because he shouted, because he made everyone else go quiet. Silas stepped farther into the living room, even though his legs still weren't fully steady, and he continued, as if issuing orders to the entire house. "No one talks to the press. No one uses personal phones. No one goes outside alone. If anyone asks, Silas Rourke hasn't come back." Miles nodded immediately, already used to this kind of vanish and regroup tactic. Harper only watched him, as if she needed to be sure he wasn't trading her morality for a win. Silas looked at Eli again, this time more directly. "Stay." One word, short, leaving no room for argument. Eli opened his mouth to ask why, but nothing came out. Because in Silas's eyes there was something strange. Not pity, not tenderness, but recognition. As if Eli had just become part of a story Silas wouldn't allow to end wrong. Tessa turned to a wall-mounted screen, her voice still cold. "I pulled the gate camera data from last night." She tapped a few commands. A blurred image appeared, the time in the corner running in numbers, but she read it out loud in words. Close to midnight. On the screen, a vehicle stopped at the edge of the light, and a figure stepped out, the posture familiar enough that Miles tilted his head slightly. The person didn't hurry. The person walked as if checking territory that belonged to him. When the face tipped into the light, Harper didn't blink, but her hand tightened. Silas's expression didn't change either, only his eyes darkened like a storm rolling in. Tessa said the name like a hammer landing on the exact crack. Grant Harlow, the right hand, the most trusted man, the one who'd appeared near the safe house area just before the ambush. Silas said nothing for a long, drawn beat, and that silence made the entire room truly mute, as if everyone had just understood that the hunt now had a shape, a name, and the price of betrayal wouldn't be paid in blood spraying everywhere. But in the moment, the traitor realized the boss was looking straight at him, and there was no road back. Eli was taken into a small bathroom so clean it made him feel dirty in a way he couldn't hide. White tile without a single stain. Towels folded into perfect squares like the ones he'd only ever seen through hotel glass. A house staff member set a new set of clothes on the sink and stepped back out. No questions, no staring. As if Harper had made a rule in advance that no one was allowed to make him feel ashamed. Eli stood in front of the mirror and watched his face emerge as the mud rinsed away. Hollow cheeks. Dark circles from too many nights without sleep. A small scrape on his wrist. He ran water over his hair, listening to his own heart pound as if it was waiting for a slap from this polished world. But it didn't come. There was only silence, and the strange, rich scent of soap. When he stepped out, the new clothes fit. The shoes weren't torn, His stomach was filled with a bowl of hot soup, and he ate more slowly than he normally would, because he was afraid, if he ate too fast, someone would snatch it away. He still didn't believe it. He'd lived long enough on the street to know that kindness usually had a price, and that price was usually collected when you were at your weakest. Tessa didn't stay far from him, a watchful shadow, while Harper passed by now and then, not saying much, only observing as if she were calculating something larger than him. Silas didn't appear in the living room again, but his presence lived in every footstep Miles took, in the way everyone automatically lowered their voices, in the way Tessa lifted her phone and set it back down as if she was afraid of shaking an invisible wire. Eli finished eating, wiped his mouth, set the bowl down very gently, and decided that if he didn't ask now, he never would. He got up and walked down the hallway to the inner room door, where yellow light spilled out thin as a warning. Miles stood there, but when Eli stopped, Miles didn't block him. He only looked at him for a second and shifted aside, as if to say there were questions that had to be asked, even when everyone was afraid of the answers. Eli went in. Silas sat on the edge of the bed. His shirt had been changed. His wrist was lightly bandaged, but the way he held himself still looked like a man sitting on a throne. He watched Eli come closer without moving, eyes unblinking, not annoyed, only waiting. Eli felt his throat go dry, but he forced himself not to step back. "You owe me an answer," he said, his voice small but not breaking. "Why didn't anyone come?" The air in the room seemed to freeze. That question wasn't just curiosity from a child. It was an accusation aimed at the very power Silas represented, the power that made people believe he couldn't be touched. Silas held Eli's gaze for one beat longer, then let out a slow breath, as if each breath was measured. He didn't retell what happened in the woods. He didn't explain the protection chain. He said only one sentence, short and so cold it made Eli shiver. "Because someone wanted me dead. Not someone wanted to steal. Not an accident. Wanted dead. On purpose." Eli opened his mouth to ask who, but Silas lifted his eyes, and in that look was a reminder that names here were guns, and guns weren't meant to be put in a child's hands. Harper stepped in then, as if she'd heard everything from the doorway. She didn't scold Eli for daring to ask. She looked at Silas, then at Eli, and spoke in a calm voice, as if she were restoring order to a room that had just been hit by wind. "Eli, come with me." She led him out, into a small room beside the living room, a single bed and a dresser. A new blanket lay on the bed, so soft Eli didn't dare touch it right away. Harper set an old cloth bag on the bedside table, the color faded, smelling of shelters and damp paper. "These are your things," she said. "We got them back from where they took you tonight." Eli stared at the bag like he was staring at a piece of his life that had been picked up from a ditch. He reached in and touched things that were worthless to anyone else. A comb with broken teeth, a lighter with no fuel, a photograph with the corners worn pale, and then his fingers found a crumpled envelope, the edge crushed and wrinkled as if it had been picked up and put down dozens of times. Eli pulled it out halfway, then his hand stopped. He didn't open it. He'd meant to, many times, but every time he was afraid whatever was inside would shatter the last thing he still held, the belief that his mother had left without abandoning him. Harper saw the hesitation. She didn't ask what the envelope was. She only gently took it from Eli's hand, the way you take a knife that's turned back toward the person holding it. "You don't have to open it yet," she said, not too soft, but warm enough. "Some things need the right moment." Then she placed the envelope into a dresser drawer and locked it, not to hide it from Eli, but to protect him from his own fear. Eli stood still, chest heavy as stone, yet inside him a thin, new thread of something like safety began to form. Harper turned toward the door. At the far end of the hallway, Miles murmured something to her. Harper listened, and her expression shifted just slightly, like someone maintaining calm who had just felt a line get yanked. She moved quickly toward the living room. Tessa stood at the table with a white envelope in her hand. No stamp, no postmark, as if it had appeared inside the house on its own. Tessa set it down, opened it, and slid out a photograph. The room fell into silence when Harper saw it. In the picture was Eli in the woods, the moment he turned his head under the light, mud still on his face, fear filling his eyes, and around the photo a rough red circle had been drawn, like a target. Beneath it, a single line printed in bold, cold as an order. "Give the kid back." The unmarked envelope lay on the table like a stone set in the middle of still water. It didn't have to be big to make ripples. Harper didn't ask who delivered it. because that kind of question belonged to people who still believed locked doors and cameras were magic. She only looked at Silas. He stood in the living room doorway, his expression unchanged, but his eyes darkened like rain rolling in. Tessa spoke quickly, her voice flat, saying there were no signs of a break-in, no image of a courier, no unfamiliar vehicle entering the gate. Miles repeated one observation that made the air turn colder. If the envelope got in, it meant someone inside the network opened a path, or someone knew this place down to its very breath. Eli wasn't in the living room anymore. Harper had taken him back to his room, but his presence still hung there like a taut thread, because that photograph made it clear the enemy didn't just want Silas erased. They wanted the small witness who had seen. Silas didn't say a word about the photograph. He didn't slam a fist down. He didn't swear. He turned to Tessa, his voice low but final. "Lock the channels," Tessa answered immediately. It was already done. Silas nodded. "Open exactly one channel, the channel people trust the most." Tessa hesitated. In this world, some channels were a backbone. Touching them meant declaring war on your own organization. Harper looked at Silas and understood he was about to do something dangerous, in the quietest way. "Are you sure?" Silas didn't answer her question. He asked another one instead, like placing a piece on the board. "Of the people still allowed to call me directly, who called last night?" Tessa flicked her eyes to the screen. "Grant called. You didn't pick up." Silas nodded again, as if confirming what he'd smelled the moment he woke. "Good." He turned away and walked into the small office in the back, the room with screens and a safe, where everything was so clean it felt threatening. Harper followed. Miles stood outside the door like a wall. Silas opened the safe and took out a thin file, not thick, yet heavy enough to kill a man without laying a hand on him. He set it on the desk, pulled a blank sheet of paper, wrote a few lines, then handed it to Tessa. "This information goes through one channel only. Say it like it slipped out. Say it like I'm desperate. Say it like I'm leaving the safe house near dawn, taking the old route to meet a contact, because I need to move before the police catch the scent." Tessa read, her eyes narrowing slightly. "This is bait." "This is a measuring stick," Silas corrected. "Bait only needs someone to bite. A measuring stick tells you who bleeds." Harper felt cold along her spine, because it meant Silas had chosen a trap designed not to make the enemy bleed, but to force the man inside his own house to show his face. And the man inside was what killed fastest. Silas didn't send a text. He didn't make a call. He only signaled. And Tessa turned his words into a small scrap of information that drifted through the internal channel like a half-finished sentence. No signature. No confirmation. Only enough for whoever was waiting to believe Silas had panicked. Harper watched the organization move, and for the first time she saw it clearly. Silas's power wasn't in guns. It was in the way he could make an entire system shift with a single sentence. They waited. Not long, only a short stretch, just long enough that Eli in his room heard nothing but silence and thought he'd been forgotten. When the small light on Tessa's screen blinked, Silas stepped closer, eyes unblinking. "Who asked again?" Tessa looked, and her face went slightly pale in a way that was hard to notice on features trained to stay cold. "Not anyone new. Someone old." "Name," Silas said. One word, like a firing order. Tessa swallowed. "Ronan Pike." The name dropped into the room like a piece of metal. Ronan wasn't a low-level man. Ronan was someone who'd followed Silas from the beginning, someone who'd stood watch through rain-soaked nights without a warm coat, someone who'd sworn on a family ring he would never sell out. Harper looked at Silas, waiting for a reaction, but Silas only stared at the air in front of him, as if reading invisible text. "Bring him in," he said. No noise. No hands. Tessa nodded, her eyes flashing with irritation because she understood. With a trusted man, this would be the deepest cut. Ronan was brought into the office not long after. He looked terrifyingly normal. Neat coat, combed hair. No sign of fear. Like a man who believed he was still standing in the right place. When the door closed, Miles stayed outside. Harper was inside with Silas. Tessa stood in the corner like a living camera. Silas didn't ask, "Why did you do it?" He asked something else, so light Ronan almost smiled. "Do you know I was just buried alive?" Ronan stalled for a beat. "I heard." "Then you also know a child pulled me out of that pit," Silas continued, and this time his eyes sharpened. "And you still asked what route I'd take." Ronan swallowed. I only wanted to protect you. Silas nodded as if agreeing, then pushed the thin file across the desk toward Ronan. Then protect me. Look. Ronan opened it, and his expression changed like a man whose clothes had been stripped off in cold wind. It wasn't blood. It wasn't violence. It was numbers. Split transfers. Intermediate accounts. A chain of transactions, holding hands like footprints. And at the end of those footprints, Ronan's name appeared again and again. Steady, clean, too consistent to be an accident. Silas didn't raise his voice. I don't need to hit you. I only need to hand this to Holt. Or to my auditor. You won't just lose your freedom. You'll lose the name Loyal you've been living on. Ronan trembled. Boss, Silas cut him off with one final question. A question that closed the door. Who ordered it cleaned? Ronan went silent, his eyes reddening, and then he finally bowed his head, like a man forced to choose between two deaths. Cyrus, he said, his voice breaking. Cyrus Rourke said if you disappeared, the organization would be stable. He said it would only take you not coming back to the board. Silas didn't show victory. He only stood there, as if he'd retrieved a piece of bone that had been hidden. Harper felt cold along her spine, because Cyrus wasn't a stranger from the street. Cyrus was blood. Cyrus was someone who had the right to move through Silas's life the way he moved through his own house. Silas closed the file again, didn't touch Ronan anymore, only said, Get out of my sight, and remember, you're alive because I want the truth more than I want blood. Ronan staggered out. When the door shut, Harper looked at Silas, her voice quiet but steady. Cyrus won't stop. Silas turned to her, his eyes no longer hiding anything. Cyrus won't stop here, he said, each word hammered into the wall. He wants me off the board. Cyrus Rourke showed up in the afternoon when the sunlight had turned the color of pale honey, the kind of light that makes every house look gentler, and every word look more sincere. The steel gate opened by command from the system. No sirens, no noise, but enough for Tessa to lift her head like an animal catching an unfamiliar scent. Miles stood close to the window, watching a silver luxury car glide into the yard at a measured pace. Not rushed, not hurried, as if the man inside had never had to ask permission to step into anything that belonged to the Rourke name. Harper was in the temporary office, where she'd just heard Tessa report the name Cyrus, along with a brief note that he'd called first, but didn't wait for an answer. Harper stepped into the hallway just as Cyrus entered the foyer. Dark coat, tie perfectly set, a face that resembled Silas in the line of the jaw and the shape of the eyes, with one difference. Cyrus carried a smile, soft as velvet, the kind that made people hesitate to refuse even when instinct screamed that they should. Harper. Cyrus opened his arms like a relative, reunited after a long time, his voice low and warm. I heard what happened. I came to see how my nephew is doing. Harper didn't step forward for a hug. She only gave a polite nod, her gaze never leaving Cyrus's hands, the hands wearing the family ring with its cold shine. Silas is recovering, she said. He needs quiet. Cyrus sighed like a man who truly cared, then let his eyes drift toward the staircase where Miles and Tessa stood guard. I've always wanted quiet for the boy, he said, and it sounded like a blessing and like a statement of ownership. Eli, meanwhile, was in the secondary living room, sitting on the rug, busy fitting together a puzzle Harper had given him to keep his hands occupied and his mind from drifting back to the woods. When Cyrus stepped into the room, his eyes found Eli immediately, and the smile came again, gentler this time, almost the smile of a kind uncle you'd meet in ordinary life. Well, Cyrus said, lowering himself just enough not to frighten Eli, you must be the little hero. Eli looked up. He wasn't used to being called a hero. He was even less used to a grown man speaking softly to him inside a house that shone like this. Cyrus offered a small box wrapped in pretty paper. Not too lavish. The kind of gift chosen carefully, so it looked like thoughtfulness, not a bribe. Just something small, Cyrus said. Snacks and a few comic books. I hear kids like those. Eli glanced at Harper as if asking permission. Harper hadn't even spoken yet when Cyrus gave a mild, understanding laugh, as if he knew every invisible rule in this place. Don't worry, he told Harper. I'm not here to make anyone uncomfortable. I just want this child to know the Rourke family isn't ungrateful. Harper kept her face neutral, but inside she felt a needle, because Cyrus was choosing every word to frame Eli as a debt, and a debt could always be collected in whatever way the collector preferred. Eli took the gift box and murmured a small thank you. Cyrus patted his head very lightly, exactly the kind of touch that looked affectionate without crossing far enough to be called an intrusion. For a few minutes, everything looked peaceful, as if Cyrus were a good uncle and Silas were simply a nephew who'd had an accident. If someone watched this without knowing what lay beneath, they might believe this family still had humanity, and that was the trap. Harper watched Cyrus talk with Eli, listened as he asked harmless questions, like his name, his age, what he liked to eat, where he'd slept before. Eli answered hesitantly, but he wasn't entirely afraid, because Cyrus's voice was soft and his eyes were warm. Harper almost let herself slip into the feeling that maybe she'd been wrong to see Cyrus as a threat. Then the moment happened, so fast that if Harper had blinked, she would have missed it. Cyrus turned toward the table by the window, where Tessa had placed the unmarked envelope inside a sealed plastic box. Cyrus's eyes slid over that box, then slid back to Eli, and they were no longer the eyes of family. They were the eyes of someone pricing a piece of merchandise. Just one sweep, cold and calculating. The way you look at a new card that's fallen into your hand and ask yourself what it's worth. Harper caught that flicker, and every soft note in Cyrus's voice turned into something artificial in her ears. She stepped forward one pace and placed herself between Eli and Cyrus, without making it obvious. "Eli needs rest," Harper said, smiling politely. "Go upstairs, okay?" Eli hugged the gift box, stood, and followed a house staff member. Cyrus watched him go, the smile still there, but it didn't reach his eyes. The second Eli disappeared, Tessa moved in close to Harper and held out her phone, showing a set of figures. Harper looked, and cold ran down her spine. Her charity fund account, the one she used to support soup kitchens and programs for children, showed transfers moving out in a chain, split into smaller amounts, clean as math, then disappearing through a shell company. This wasn't a mistake. Someone was twisting Harper's bright public face into a laundering tool, and when the scandal broke, the person dragged into the lights would be her, not the one behind it. Cyrus saw Harper looking at the phone, and he clicked his tongue with something like pity. "Harper," he said gently, "you do too many good things. Sometimes people take advantage of good people." Harper lifted her eyes. "You know about this." Cyrus pressed a hand to his chest as if wounded. "I'm only guessing. Our family has too many enemies." Harper didn't argue there. She kept her voice calm because she understood. Cyrus wanted her to explode so he could claim she'd lost control. "Where's Silas?" Cyrus asked like a concerned uncle. Miles answered briefly that Silas was resting. Cyrus nodded, then offered a sentence that sounded like a blessing. "I'll speak with my nephew for a moment, privately." Harper started to follow, but Silas appeared at the end of the hallway, moving slowly but straight, steel gray eyes refusing to be led. He looked at Cyrus without greeting him, only tipped his head slightly as if granting permission. Cyrus passed Harper, the smile still perfectly arranged for family, and when the two men entered the small office, the door closed, and the noise of the house seemed to switch off. Harper stood outside, her hand tightening, and she heard Cyrus's voice from inside, still warm, but the blade now visible. "Silas," Cyrus said, slow as if teaching a lesson, "you know I don't want to do anything bad. I want to save the family." Then a beat of silence, and after that, the last sentence dropped like stone. "Hand over the ledger, or the boy disappears." Eli hadn't meant to eavesdrop. He only meant to step out of his room for a moment, because the new blanket was so soft it made him feel like a thief, lying on something that belonged to someone else, and because the image of that photo circled in red kept echoing in his head like a reminder that he wasn't allowed to relax. Barefoot, he slipped into the hallway and moved as lightly as he could, the habit of children who've slept in places where one wrong sound gets you thrown out. As he passed the small office, he heard Cyrus's voice, warm but sharp, and then he heard the final line, like a hammer driving into his chest. "Hand over the ledger, or the boy disappears." Eli froze behind the wall, the feeling of someone having called his name in a room full of guns. He didn't know what a ledger was, but he knew exactly who the boy was. It was him, and if he stayed here, they would use him to pressure Silas, and Silas would have to choose between power and a child who didn't belong in this house. Eli had lived with cruel adult choices his whole life, and he didn't want to become the reason someone died or did something they couldn't undo. He went back to his room, shoved his feet into his shoes, grabbed the new coat, then dropped it because it looked too clean, too easy to spot. In the end, he chose his own old jacket from the bag, worn and torn, but familiar like a second skin. He tucked Cyrus's gift box into the drawer, not because he hated it, but because he didn't want to carry anything from this house and then have to pay it back. He opened the small window at the end of the hall, where the night wind cut in cold, climbed down onto the grass the way he'd climbed out of shelter fences before. Quick, clean, not looking back. The second his feet hit the ground, he ran. Not along the main path, not through the gate, only along the tree line, into the pockets of darkness cameras struggled to see. He knew Harper would search. He also knew that if Harper searched with a full team of guards, the engine noise and lights would draw the hunter in even faster. So he ran far enough that when they discovered he was gone, they would choose to protect Silas instead of chasing a kid. Harper realized Eli was missing not from a sound, but from the silence. The small room was empty. The blanket had been thrown aside. The drawer was cracked open like a clumsy goodbye. She stood still for exactly one beat, the beat of someone forcing herself not to panic. Tessa wanted to call people in immediately, but Harper stopped her with a look. "No," she said, voice low. "If we make noise, the boy will panic, and they'll catch him first." Miles moved to go after him, but Harper was already pulling on her coat, moving fast out the back door alone, like a mother chasing after a child who'd just left home for the first time. She didn't take a gun. She didn't take a group. She took only a small flashlight and her own voice. Outside, the wind had picked up. The pines whispered in a long, restless hush, and the safe house lights couldn't reach behind the garden. Harper called softly, "Eli." No answer. She followed fresh prints pressed into damp grass, small shoe marks, quick steps, leading toward the service road behind the trees. She quickened her pace, heart hammering, mind still clear, still calculating. Eli would run toward what he knew, where he'd slept before, where he believed no one would look. "Eli," Harper called again, and this time her voice fractured slightly. Not because she feared for herself, but because she feared Eli would fall back into the loop of homeless children. Run, get caught, run again. She saw a small shadow ahead, the familiar worn jacket, not the new one, and Harper let out a breath like she'd just grabbed hold of a line. "Stop," she said, not as an order, only a steady plea. "You aren't a burden. You aren't a card to be played." Eli halted half a step, as if those words yanked him back. He turned, eyes red from the wind, his voice rough. "They'll use me," he said fast, as if he was afraid he'd change his mind if he slowed down. "They said hand over the ledger or I disappear. I don't want him to have to choose." Harper stepped closer, one step, her hand extended, palm open, empty, not forcing. "You don't have to make yourself disappear to save anyone," she said. "You only have to let the adults do their work, and my work is keeping you safe." Eli stared at that hand, hesitating, when the sound of a car rolling over gravel rose from the corner of the road, not loud like police, not frantic like someone fleeing, but even uncertain, like someone who'd chosen the time. Harper snapped her head around. Headlights swept through the trees, throwing Eli's shadow long across the ground. A dark vehicle stopped tight to the shoulder. The rear door popped open so fast, Harper barely had time to step back and shield Eli. Everything happened cleanly, like a practice drill. A man stepped out, said nothing, only grabbed Eli from behind, one hand clamped over his mouth, the other locking around his arm. Eli thrashed, eyes wide with terror, and in the instant he was pulled through the light, he saw a small tattoo on the man's wrist. Not flashy, only a simple symbol like a stylized bird inside a circle, the same symbol he'd glimpsed on the jacket of a man at the safe house when Tessa skimmed the camera footage and mentioned Grant. Eli tried to scream, but the sound was swallowed. Harper lunged, but a second man moved in front of her, not striking, only lifting a hand in warning, and Harper understood that if she pushed one beat farther, they could hurt Eli to make her stop. The car door slammed. The sound punched into the night like a full stop. The vehicle backed out, turned, and vanished behind the trees as if it had never existed. Harper stood in the service road, breath broken, her hand still reaching as if trying to hold on to empty air. She forced herself not to scream. She ran back toward the safe house, eyes burning from the wind and from something else, and dialed Silas on the internal line before she even made it back through the gate. When Silas answered, he said only one word. "Speak." Harper swallowed, each word cutting through her throat. "Eli is gone." On the other end, Silas went silent for exactly one beat, a silence that chilled Harper more than the wind. Then his voice came, not raised, not shaking, only dense and sure, like an iron door closing. Lock every exit. The instant the steel gate shut, the entire safe house shifted into a different rhythm. Not the frantic rhythm of people losing control, but the cold rhythm of a machine that had just been switched on. Silas didn't ask Harper what color the vehicle was or what the plate might have been, because he knew that in the dark, those answers were often exactly what the enemy wanted people to cling to, while time slipped away. He stood in the office with his hand on the desk as if it rested on an invisible map, and he gave orders in a voice so low it sounded like a whisper, yet no one dared ignore it. "Open your eyes across the city." Tessa nodded, her fingers sliding across 3 screens as she pulled up camera feeds from gas stations, bus depots, 24/7 convenience stores, and lighted intersections where cars were forced to slow down. Miles had already put on his coat and fitted his earpiece, ready to move, but Silas held him back with a single sentence. "Don't go by feeling. Go by the trail." Harper stood beside them, face drained white, but her voice stayed hard. "Eli's alive. They want us to react." Silas didn't look at her, but his answer sounded like a ruthless vow. They won't kill him before they're done using him. Harper hated that sentence because it was true, and because it turned a child into a countdown clock. Silas turned to Miles. "Pull the list of drivers, vans, night deliveries, anyone who can leave the area without being noticed." Miles tapped a small device and sent a signal out like dropping a net into water. Men who wore no uniforms and no badges moved through places ordinary people never truly noticed. Gas stations, fast food counters, supermarket parking lots, late-night cafes. Silas's eyes and ears didn't need guns to exist. They existed on the habit of listening and watching. Harper watched the network unfold and felt both disgust and gratitude, because if someone else had this kind of reach, Eli wouldn't have a chance. Tessa enlarged a frame from the gas station camera near the service road where Eli had been taken. A dark vehicle slid through, the plate unreadable. "Not enough," Tessa said. Silas stayed calm. "Then go farther. They have to stop." He looked at Harper for a second. "Pick the routes a kidnapper wants to avoid." Harper understood immediately. The main highway had heavy camera coverage, so they'd cut onto side roads where only a few unavoidable points of light existed. Gas stations, bus depots, overnight stores. Miles received a wordless call, only a single beep, and he answered with one word, "Yes." He looked up. "One of our drivers saw a dark vehicle stop at a 24/7 store not long ago. 2 men bought water and duct tape." At the word duct tape, Harper's heart tightened, but Silas didn't let emotion steal the tempo. "Get the camera from there. Match faces. Don't chase plates." Tessa did it, and a face appeared on the screen under a low, pulled cap. Not clear, but the man's wrist showed for a second, and Tessa zoomed in. "The bird symbol in a circle," she said, her voice colder. Harper shuddered, because it matched exactly what Eli had managed to see. "Grant's line," Miles said. Silas didn't move, eyes like stone. "Good. Now we've got a name." He turned to Tessa. "Build a false signal. Make them believe we're impulsive." Tessa understood immediately and started typing commands. An internal call was pushed through as if it had slipped out by accident, that Silas would go in person to an old warehouse on the edge of the city because he'd received word Eli was being held there. It was information sweet enough to make whoever was behind this want to watch Silas run headfirst into it. Harper looked at Silas, lips pressed tight. "You're going." "No," Silas said, and that single no made Harper flinch because it ran against the image of a furious boss. Silas stepped up behind Tessa's shoulder, eyes on the screens like eyes on a chessboard. "They want me to show my face. I won't give it." Tessa suddenly raised her voice, deliberately loud enough for the channels to catch it, like a woman panicking over losing the boy. "Boss, we can't sit here. What if Eli dies?" Harper felt cold, because Tessa was acting so well it made the room feel like it might crack. Silas didn't change expression. "I said no. Send people to the warehouse. Don't let me appear." And while Tessa kept performing panic, Miles slipped out of the safe house through the back door. No lights, no clear capture of his face on internal cameras, like a shadow sliding into the night. He didn't go straight to the warehouse. He went wide, tracking the source he'd just released, hunting whoever swallowed the bait. The camera network led to the real old warehouse, and exactly as predicted, a dark vehicle drove up, stopped at the warehouse door, then left immediately, as if it was only checking whether Silas would show. "The warehouse is empty," Tessa said after the team reported back. Harper felt her insides sink. An empty warehouse, a trap, and time. But Silas gave a small nod, as if this was the answer he needed. "They're measuring the response," he said. "And they just lost something." Harper stared at him. Lost what? Silas didn't look at her. He looked at the screen where the car had just pulled away. "The advantage that makes me impulsive." He turned to Tessa. "Let them think they won, so they get confident and talk more." Tessa immediately sent another panicked signal through the internal channels, as if Silas was shouting inside the safe house because the warehouse was empty. Harper hated listening to those words, but she understood it was the only way to pull the enemy out of the dark. Meanwhile, Miles was already tailing the vehicle that left the warehouse from a distance, not close enough to be spotted, not far enough to lose it. He followed it through 2 turns, past a gas station, then onto a dark road leading toward the industrial district. He logged everything not with a camera, but with memory and location. Silas stood inside the safe house with his hand on the desk, eyes unblinking. He didn't need blood. He needed an address. And then Harper's phone vibrated. Not a call. A message from an unknown number. No name. Just one line that turned her rigid. "Come alone if you want to hear the boy speak." The message sat on Harper's phone screen like a hand clamped around her throat, because it wasn't only a threat. It was a script already written, forcing her into the role of the mother, who walks into the dark cave to trade for the sound of a child breathing. Harper didn't reply right away. She lifted her eyes to Silas, and in his steel-gray gaze there was no panic, only a frightening stillness, like the sea before a storm. "You aren't going," Harper said first, as if laying another layer of law over the cliff's edge. Silas didn't argue, but he didn't soften it with a warm promise either. "You go alone," he said, voice low, "but you're never alone." Harper understood. She turned to Tessa. "I need clean evidence. If we touch this wrong, Eli becomes the sacrifice in a revenge. No one wins." Tessa looked to Silas for the order, and Silas only gave a single nod, enough to open a door Harper had kept sealed, working with the police in a way that wouldn't collapse the house. Harper dialed a number she'd saved from charity work, Detective Aaron Holt. Holt picked up fast like a man who never got enough sleep, his voice dry and wary. "Rourke." Harper didn't circle it. "I need you, right now. A child's been taken." Holt paused for a beat, then asked the one question that mattered. "Who do you want me to arrest?" "I want you to help me get evidence to arrest the right person," Harper said. "Not a story, not a guess. Evidence." Holt didn't trust the Mafia, but he trusted evidence more than anything. Location. Harper read the location from the message. A meeting point at the edge of the industrial district, where abandoned warehouses sat close to a main road and traffic cameras still ran. Holt answered briefly that he would set up lawful surveillance and recording equipment according to procedure. No dirty trap that would get overturned in court. Harper felt part of her loosen, because she knew that if this turned into blood, Eli wouldn't be saved. Eli would be used as an excuse for killing. Holt told Harper to keep the message, not delete it, not reply, so they could trace it. Harper hung up and turned to Silas. "I'm going." Silas stepped closer. He didn't touch her face the way love stories do. He only put a hand around her wrist, fingers tightening slightly, a signal that he was present. "Listen carefully," Silas said. "If they tell you to step through a door you can't see past, you turn back. If they tell you to get into a car, you turn back. You have to live to bring him home." Harper nodded, eyes locked on his. "You too," she said, and that sentence was a rope pulling Silas back from the edge. She left the safe house in an ordinary car. No loud escort, no priority lights, only a small pin Holt provided for lawful recording, and another car at a distance far enough, police, unmarked. When Harper arrived, the sky was fully dark. The streetlights were a dull yellow, and the wind ran through metal fencing with a shriek like a warning. A warehouse sat silent with its roll-up door half shut, light spilling from inside in a thin strip. Harper stepped out, keeping her hands visible, carrying no bag, nothing that could be framed as a weapon. She walked in slow steps, like she was negotiating with a shadow. "Eli," she called, not loud, only loud enough for the microphone to catch. No answer came, but there was a small sound, like something being dragged across concrete. The roll-up door lifted a little more, and Harper saw Eli. He sat on a metal chair, wrists loosely bound with plastic ties. Not tight, not bleeding, but enough to remind him he couldn't stand up on his own. His mouth wasn't covered, but a man stood behind him, a hand on his shoulder like a clamp. When Eli saw Harper, his eyes went wide, relief and fear at once, as if one more step from Harper would turn him into the reason they did something cruel. Harper held back her fast breathing and kept her voice steady. "I came alone," she said. "Now let the boy go." A laugh rose from deeper shadow inside the warehouse. "You're good at keeping your word." A man stepped forward, a fitted coat, hair neatly combed, a calm walk like he was entering a meeting, not a kidnapping. Harper felt her skin go cold when she recognized the face. Not a stranger, not a disposable thug, the man everyone called the most loyal. "Grant Harlow," Harper said, almost not believing it. Grant smiled and didn't deny it. "Harper." He dipped his head slightly like greeting a lady of the house. "I thought you'd bring Silas, but it looks like you understand the rules better than I expected." Harper looked at Eli. "I'm not playing," she said. "I'm taking the child back." Grant sighed like a man disappointed. "You've misunderstood. I don't need the child. I need what the child pulled out of the pit." Harper felt her heart slam. Grant knew Silas was alive, and Grant wanted to pull Silas out of the dark. Grant lifted a hand in a small signal, and in the corner of the warehouse a small camera clicked on, its red light glowing like an eye opening. Harper understood immediately. This wasn't only kidnapping, this was a stage. Grant wanted to record the moment Silas appeared, lost control, struck, so the boss could be turned into a criminal in front of the law, the media, anyone still hesitating to stand with him. Grant raised his voice slightly, as if for the camera. "Where's Silas, Harper? You don't want me to make the kid more afraid." Eli trembled, but he lifted his chin anyway, looking at Harper like he was begging her not to call Silas. Harper kept her face cold. "What do you want?" "The ledger," Grant said, "and confirmation that Silas will leave the board, permanently." Harper swallowed hard. She knew the ledger was the organization's backbone, the thing that let traitors live by holding other people's throats. She couldn't promise it. Grant stepped closer, and the man behind Eli squeezed his shoulder just a little, enough to make Eli flinch. Harper saw it, and pain shot through her, but she wasn't allowed to break. "Don't touch him," she said, voice sharp. Grant gave a small, amused smile. "I'm being very gentle." Then he lifted his gaze toward the warehouse opening as if speaking to the air. "Silas, if you can hear me, you know I'm right. You're the boss. You can't let a child die because of your ego." Harper heard that and knew Grant was baiting Silas, pressing the exact buttons of protection and rage. And she knew Silas was close, because if Silas hadn't been close, Harper wouldn't have survived getting here. In the darkness outside the warehouse, Silas truly was there, staying out of the light, keeping his face off the camera, with Miles beside him and farther back Holt and his team. Silas listened to Grant, listened to Eli breathing, and his hand clenched until it went white. Harper didn't look toward Silas, but she felt his presence like electricity. Grant pushed one more time, louder now, sharper. "You're hiding behind your wife's skirt. Come out. Do what you do best. Let the camera show the whole city what you are." It was bait. Perfect bait. An impulsive boss would step into the light. An impulsive boss would become a criminal on camera. But Silas didn't step out. The silence stretched long enough that Grant's brow tightened. The first slip in his rhythm. Silas shifted a single step in the shadows, just enough for Harper to hear a small sound and know he was holding himself back with sheer will. When Silas spoke, his voice didn't come from inside the warehouse. It came from outside, from a place the camera couldn't catch his face. Only the sound. "You want me to hit you so you've got an excuse," Silas said, each word icy. "I won't give it to you." Grant smiled, but the smile stiffened. "You think you can control this?" "I can," Silas answered, "because I don't need blood. I need the truth." Harper heard that and knew Silas was doing the hardest thing a Mafia boss can do. Holding back. Holding back to save Eli. Holding back to keep the law intact. Holding back to make Grant the one who broke the law, not the one who got punched. From farther away, Holt signaled for Harper to keep the conversation going a few more lines so the recording would be complete. Harper looked at Grant. "You kidnapped a child," she said, clear and slow. "You're threatening him. You want to trade for the ledger. You want Silas off the board." Grant shrugged like he didn't care. "Call it whatever you want. I call it leverage." That was enough. Harper saw Holt move. In the brief burst of controlled chaos, when a figure outside flashed at the edge of the light, the man holding Eli startled and his grip loosened. Miles moved in on the exact beat. No beating, only a joint lock, pulling Eli free the way you pull something precious out of fire. Harper lunged and held Eli tight against her, shielding his face from the camera light. Eli shook hard, but he was clear enough to lean close to Harper's ear and whisper one sentence that made Harper's blood turn to ice. "My father is coming." Eli was brought back to the safe house without any serious injuries, but his eyes looked like they'd just run through a storm no one else could see. Harper wrapped him in a blanket, set a mug of warm milk in front of him, and sat beside him without pushing him to talk, because she understood that some fears, if dragged out too early, turn into knives. Silas stayed at the far end of the living room, not moving closer, as if respecting a boundary, and also punishing himself for nearly getting pulled into Grant's trap. Tessa reported that Holt had captured enough audio and video to open a case for kidnapping and coercion, but Grant withdrew fast, leaving an empty warehouse and something more unsettling than failure, the feeling that he wanted the world to see Silas as a monster and himself as the one who saved the day. Harper remembered what Eli had whispered about his father and felt a long, cold stretch open in her chest, because whoever came next wouldn't wear the mask of a gangster. He would wear the mask of a father. Holt left with a short promise that he would follow procedure, but procedure was usually slower than predators. And that was exactly what happened. Before the next day was even fully bright, the phone in the safe house was ringing again and again with unknown calls. News spread the way it always did when no one had to say the quiet part out loud. A child abducted, a Rourke woman seen in an industrial district, and the story needed only one twist to become a scandal. By midday, the living room screen lit up with the image of a man standing in front of the city police station, a few news vans behind him and microphones pointed at him like spears. Harper saw Eli lift his head at the sound, then curl inward, drawing the blanket tighter. The man on screen had a narrow face, stubble trimmed on purpose to look worn down, a cheap jacket that was clean, eyes red as if he'd cried all night. He held up an old photograph of Eli, raising it to the cameras like evidence. "My name is Travis Carter," he said, his voice trembling at the right moments. "I'm Eli's biological father. My son has been kidnapped by the Mafia." The words went off like a firecracker inside Harper's head. "The Mafia kidnapped my son." A sentence short enough to share, sharp enough to inflame, clean enough to believe. Travis turned from one reporter to the next and delivered a story that sounded rehearsed, that he'd been searching for months, that powerful men had lured his boy in and were holding him, that there were armed men, that the boss's wife had shown up and threatened him. Travis didn't use crude words. He used the language of a victim. He talked about child safety, about a father's rights, about the fear of a child being turned into a chess piece. Harper listened and felt gooseflesh rise, because every line he spoke was exactly what people wanted to hear if they ignored one detail, that Eli had run from adults like Travis to survive on the street. Tessa stood by the television, eyes cold. "Good acting," she said. "Too good," Holt said immediately as he came into the safe house through a discreet entrance, his coat still smelling like the road, his face tired but his eyes awake. Harper flinched because she hadn't expected him to arrive that fast. Holt watched the screen for a moment, then gave a small shake of his head. "He's hitting the beats," Holt said, crying on cue, pausing on cue, raising the photo on cue. People don't do that when they're truly missing a child. They panic. "He's performing." Harper looked at Holt. "What are you going to do?" Holt didn't answer right away. He glanced toward Eli, then back to the screen where Travis was adding that he knew his son was being held in a place called a safe house, that there was a steel gate, security, rules like a prison. Harper felt the blood in her body turn cold. How did Travis know? She'd never said safe house to anyone outside the inner circle. Holt caught it too. He muted the television, his voice harder now. "He's got details only an insider would know." Harper clenched her hand. "Someone's feeding him." Holt nodded. "And he didn't come to the station for help. He came to frame you and Silas in public. Once the public believes him, the court listens." Harper looked at Eli and saw the boy staring at the screen without blinking, face drained pale, as if being pulled back to a place he'd tried to forget. Silas stepped forward and stood behind Harper, not speaking, but his presence thickened the air. Holt turned to Silas, his tone no longer cold, only direct. "If you step forward and react, you help him. If you stay silent, he'll push the story farther. We need evidence, and we need to keep that boy out of his hands. Silas looked at the screen once, then at Eli, his eyes darkening. He didn't hate Travis with impulsive rage. He hated him like a man who understood Travis was using the most frightening weapon of all, the title of biological father, to snatch back control. Harper knelt in front of Eli, keeping her voice soft so she wouldn't crack him. Eli, do you know that man? Eli swallowed hard, eyes still on the screen. He's my father, he whispered, like saying a curse out loud. Harper forced herself to stay calm. Do you want to see him? Eli shook his head very slightly, almost invisible, and pulled the blanket higher. Holt watched that and became even more certain. He's here for leverage, not for the child. Right then, Eli's phone buzzed once, a small vibration. Weak, but in the quiet house it landed like metal on the floor. Harper looked, her heart tightening. An unknown number, a short message. Eli opened it, his pupils widening, his hand shaking so hard the phone almost slipped. Harper grabbed it and read, and it felt like the floor shifted under her. I know what happened to your mother. Travis's message landed like a finger pressed into the one place Eli had spent his whole life trying to cover, and in a single beat, the warm room of the safe house turned into a cold hallway, with wind slipping through. Eli couldn't speak. His throat felt locked. His eyes stared at the phone screen, then slid away from it, as if not looking could make the words disappear. But the words didn't disappear. They clung to his skin like dirty rainwater. Rain. Eli blinked, and the smell of that year rushed back. Not clean rain, but rain mixed with exhaust and damp trash in the old boarding house district, where the tin roof rattled like someone was throwing stones at the sky. He saw himself smaller than he was now. Arms wrapped around a thin bag of belongings, standing under a narrow walkway, water dripping off the roof onto the back of his neck. An argument spilled out of the last room at the end of the corridor. A man's voice grinding, a woman's voice answering in broken bursts, angry and exhausted at the same time. Eli couldn't make out every word. He only heard the rhythm of a life being torn. Then the door flew open. His mother stepped out, hair wet, coat too thin, eyes red. And still she tried to smile at him like she could make everything all right. Eli, go inside, she said, her voice trembling slightly. He shook his head, because he didn't want to leave her alone with that grinding voice. That was the first wrong decision. He followed her down the stairs, rain slapping his face, wind yanking at his clothes like it wanted to rip them away. His mother looked back at the room door as if she was looking at something she had just escaped, and she said one sentence that Eli could still hear clearly even now. It's okay, baby. We just have to go. But he didn't just go. He turned back. He thought if he grabbed the wallet he'd seen on the table, if he took the keys, if he said something loud enough, it would stop. He ran back up, feet slipping on wet steps, eased the door open, and in the thin yellow light he saw a man's silhouette near the window, an arm raised. His mother screamed, and something shattered. No blood in the memory, only sound, glass breaking, wind screaming. His mother calling his name like she was pulling him back from a cliff. Eli stumbled back, his foot catching, and he remembered the moment of his choice, the second wrong choice. He ran out to find help, but the corridor was empty, the rain thick, and no one opened a door. When he turned back, his mother was lying at the base of the stairs, eyes open but unfocused, her hand reaching out like she was trying to touch him one last time. He called for her, called until his throat went raw, but only the rain answered. And after that, one sentence formed in his mind like a curse. If I hadn't turned back, if I hadn't run, if I'd done it right, she wouldn't have. Eli snapped back to the present when Harper touched his shoulder lightly. He flinched as if shocked, eyes red, breathing fast, his whole body curling inward, not from cold, but from guilt. Harper looked at him. She didn't ask for details. She didn't force him to tell it. She only said softly, "You're here. You're safe." But Eli shook his head. Tears spilled suddenly, like he'd held them too long. "No," he said, his voice breaking. "I'm not safe. Wherever I am, I pull other people down." He shot to his feet and backed away from Harper, like he was backing away from something too good to be allowed to keep. "I have to go," he said fast, convincing himself with his own fear. "If I stay here, they'll use me. They'll take you. They'll force him. I don't want anyone to die because of me." Harper stood up and faced him. No raised voice, no tears. only a bluntness that shut the door on self-punishment. "Listen to me," Harper said, each word clear and slow. "You aren't leverage. You're a child." It wasn't vague comfort. It was a moral verdict, forcing Eli to see himself as a human being instead of a walking disaster. Eli cried without sound, fist knotted in his shirt, like a child finally exhausted from being an adult too early. Holt stood near the door and watched, and something like compassion flickered across his eyes. Then he went back to the job, because compassion didn't save anyone if the law wasn't standing in the right place. Holt's phone buzzed. He listened, and his face darkened. "He filed an emergency petition," Holt said, his voice sharp with disgust for the tactic. "Travis Carter is requesting temporary custody." Harper's hand tightened. "On what basis?" Holt looked down at his screen, then up. "On the basis that he's the biological father on paper. And on the story he's sold the media." Right then, Tessa turned the television back on. Not so they could watch more, but so they could see they were being attacked with images. A clip played, edited from the industrial district, showing only Harper walking into the warehouse. Only Silas's shadow in the dark. Only scattered audio, then a narration layered over it claiming the Mafia was holding children, that the boss's wife staged a kidnapping. It was dirty, but effective, because crowds believe what they see, not what they aren't allowed to see. Harper looked at Eli and saw him go pale, as if dragged back to that rainy staircase from years ago, where he'd learned to believe he was always the cause. Silas stood in the corner, silent, but the silence sat heavy as stone. He didn't rush out, because he understood that any hot reaction would become evidence against them. Holt went on, his voice clipped. "The court scheduled an emergency hearing. Very soon," Harper asked, fighting to stay calm. "When?" Holt answered, and the words hit like a hammer. "Within 1 day." Eli heard it, eyes widening, and a new fear flooded in. Not fear of the woods, not fear of being kidnapped, but fear of being pulled away from the only place that had just told him he was only a child. The courtroom was smaller than Eli had imagined when people talked about court. No booming gavel like in movies, only the scrape of chairs, the soft crackle of paper, the steady breath of the air conditioning like a reminder that feelings didn't get to decide anything in here. Eli sat in the very back row with Harper, his hands clenched together in his lap, his fingernails digging into his skin hard enough to hurt, and still he wouldn't let go because he was afraid that if he did, everything would fall. Harper wore a simple dark outfit, hair neat, a face so calm it looked cold, but Eli could see her jaw tighten every time she glanced across the aisle. Travis Carter sat on the other side in a light-colored shirt, wearing the exhausted expression of a father whose child had been stolen, with an attorney beside him leaning in to whisper lines the way you remind someone of a script. When the judge entered, Travis stood immediately, eyes red, shoulders heavy, and even the way he breathed looked practiced to make people feel for him. He began in a trembling voice, saying his son had been wandering too long, that he'd searched in desperation, that then suddenly his son vanished and resurfaced in a story connected to the Mafia, that he feared his boy was being forced into something, feared he was being used like a tool. He said the word safe again and again, talked about a father's rights, talked about the thing everyone wants to nod at. Children belong with their biological family. Harper listened without showing anything, but Eli felt his throat go dry, because a part of him was still the child who had once wanted a father, and that part made him easy to pull. Then Travis's attorney turned the knife toward Harper. He presented documents about Harper's charity fund, irregular transfers, tabloid-style headlines claiming the fund was suspected of laundering money, that the Rourke woman did charity to cover dirty cash. The words drifted through the courtroom like poisonous whispers, and Eli looked at Harper the way you look at a pillar being chipped at its base. This was the moment Harper seemed to be losing ground, because any connection to dirty money was enough to make a judge cautious, especially when the man across from her was wearing the perfect victim costume. Travis lifted his head and glanced toward Eli with a look of grief, and Eli felt his stomach tighten like a cord being pulled, because if people believed Travis, he would be taken away from Harper, away from the only place that had just taught him he wasn't a card to be played. Holt sat a row over. No flashy suit, only an old one. His face without expression, like a scale. When it was his turn, Travis still looked at Holt with confidence, as if believing the police would stand with paperwork. Holt rose, voice dry. No dramatics. "I'm Detective Aaron Holt. I object to the request for temporary custody as presented by the petitioner." Travis's attorney immediately objected, saying Holt wasn't relevant to a family dispute. Holt didn't argue at length. He asked permission to present evidence directly tied to the child's safety. The judge studied him for a few seconds, then nodded. Holt placed a report on the bench and said, clearly, that there had been a kidnapping and coercion incident in the industrial district. That in that incident, Eli had been held against his will, that recorded threats existed. Travis's attorney shot back that it was only a story, that there was no proof. Holt lifted his eyes, cold. There is. He produced the extracted text records, the number that had contacted Eli, the threatening content. He produced location information and timing, showing Travis appeared in front of the media almost immediately, with internal details a grieving father couldn't know without a source. He didn't talk about the Mafia. He spoke only about the specific risk. A man using his son as a tool to create pressure and seize control. The judge looked down at the documents longer, and for the first time Travis blinked fast, the sadness on his face shifting slightly like a mask slipping. Harper stood when it was her turn, and she didn't dress it up with pretty language. She offered proof of care over the past days, basic medical checks, notes about meals, where Eli slept, and most of all, confirmation that Eli wasn't imprisoned, wasn't coerced, that he was being protected from the people who had tracked him and kidnapped him. She didn't paint herself as a savior. She simply spoke the truth in the voice of a woman who had chosen to do what was right. Eli lived on the street. He didn't just vanish from the life of a father who cared. He ran from danger. I was simply the person who was there at the right time and didn't turn away. Travis's attorney attacked at once, saying Harper lived in a criminal world, saying her environment was filled with guards and secrets, saying that wasn't where a child should be. Harper didn't deny there were guards. She stated what mattered. There are guards because someone is hunting that boy, she said. I'm not asking the court to believe me. I'm asking the court to look at what's happening to him. When the judge asked for another witness, the room seemed to hold its breath as Silas walked in. He didn't wear anything loud, no glittering jewelry, no crime boss costume. He moved like an ordinary man, but the way people automatically went quiet as he appeared showed that ordinary was only a coat. Silas didn't look at Travis. He didn't look at reporters. He looked only at the judge. When he was questioned, he didn't tell stories, didn't blame, didn't rage. He said one sentence, short, direct, like placing a stone on the scale. I'll take responsibility for the boy's safety. Nothing more. But in that courtroom, the sentence rang like a commitment that couldn't be withdrawn. The judge looked at Silas, then at Harper, then at Holt, then back at Travis. That look wasn't the easy look that believes a crying father. It was the look of someone beginning to understand the truth was more complicated than a media script. Eli sat in the back, heart racing, because he knew the judge could decide his life with one line. The judge turned a few pages. Silent so long, Eli felt his ears begin to ring. Finally, the judge said more time was needed to consider, that a decision would come soon, that in the meantime, all parties had to follow temporary rules. Not a win, not a loss, only a waiting space. A waiting space that made a child like Eli feel suspended between two shores, and all it would take was one gust from the media, or one hard pull from the enemy, and he would fall. The court's waiting period felt like a hook hanging from the ceiling. It didn't kill you immediately, but it kept you from breathing comfortably, and Silas hated nothing more than being forced to wait while a child was still in the crosshairs. He didn't say much on the drive back to the safe house. Harper watched his face in the car window and understood that his mind had shifted to the only place he believed he could still control. Truth written in numbers, not in words. The moment he stepped into the office, Silas didn't call in soldiers. He didn't issue threats. He summoned the internal chief accountant and a team of financial attorneys, people who carried no guns but could collapse an empire in silence. Tessa stood beside him and handed over a list of accounts tied to Grant, the money trails that had moved through shell companies. Miles set a map on the desk, showing cash transaction points, warehouses, shipping routes. Silas studied it all the way you study a piece of music, then began to press the notes. Close the valve, he said. One sentence, and his system rerouted. Regular payments were paused. Shipping contracts were suspended for licensing issues. Short-term loans were called in early. Everything was legal enough that no one could label it an attack. They could only say the market had suddenly turned cold. Partners who used to sit in the middle and take their cut started calling, their voices shifting from friendly to wary. Grant would feel it immediately, because Grant lived on cash flow the way fish live on water. Harper walked in while Silas was reading a report. Her face looked tired, but her eyes were still sharp. "What are you doing?" Silas didn't look up. "I'm making the people who think they can use Eli understand one thing," he said. "Leverage isn't on the boy's wrists. Leverage is in the books." Harper understood. He was taking revenge in the safest way. No blood, no beating, only choking off lifelines one by one. But she also knew that choking like this would make the enemy bite back with something more reckless. Holt arrived later through a discreet entrance, carrying a sealed, lawful recording device and a warning. "Travis is driving the media. The court will feel pressure. You need to be ready." Harper nodded. Silas listened, then set his pen down like finishing a line of math. "Good," he said. "Then we give them evidence so clean pressure can't save them." Silas didn't summon Grant for a shadowy meeting. He set a meeting that looked almost normal. A review of financial losses after the ambush. The kind of meeting Grant couldn't refuse if he still wanted to be the right hand. Grant arrived that night, still dressed sharp, still wearing a polite smile, but his eyes were tight, because he could already feel the water pulling out from under him. Silas sat at the head of the table. No theatrics. Only a leather chair and a glass of water. Holt wasn't at the table. He was in the next room, following procedure. Recording equipment placed where the law allowed, witnesses present, the time stamped clean. Harper wasn't in the room, because Silas had promised not to drag her deeper into this mud. Miles stood at the door, not threatening, only present. Grant spoke first, voice coated in concern. "Boss, I heard there's an issue with cash flow. I'm ready to clean it up." Silas looked at Grant, eyes without a ripple. "You clean well," he said, and the line sounded like praise and like a knife. Grant gave a small laugh. "I only follow orders." "Right," Silas said. "So tell me whose orders you're following." Grant hesitated for a fraction, then regained his smoothness. "Boss, I don't understand." Silas slid a stack of papers across the table. Not thick, but enough for Grant to see the familiar numbers he believed had been erased. Transfers tied to Harper's charity fund, shell companies, frequent small withdrawals, all of it forming one straight line to accounts Grant controlled. Grant looked, his face not changing at once, only his fingers tightening slightly. "Could be someone under me made a mistake," he said. Silas tilted his head. "Then why is the digital signature fingerprint yours?" Grant went quiet for a beat, then produced a thin smile. "Boss, I don't want to argue. You're under stress because of court. I get it." That was Grant's escape route. Turn everything into Silas's emotions. Make Silas look hot-headed. Silas didn't take it. He asked a simple question, soft as a trap laid on velvet. "The night I was buried, where were you?" Grant answered fast, too smooth. "On my way home. I called you. You didn't pick up." "Did you call to save me?" Silas said evenly. "Or to confirm I was dead?" Grant laughed a little louder, as if offended. "Boss, that hurts." Silas met his eyes. "I haven't said anything as painful as the pit you left me in." Grant shifted tactics, his eyes turning colder. "You're alive. Isn't that good?" That sentence thickened the air, because it revealed the truth no loyal man ever says. Silas let Grant keep talking, let the line run out on its own. "I think the issue is we need stability," Grant said, voice low, almost advising. "Don't let a kid pull you into a mistake. Don't let Harper get dragged down. You should hand the ledger to someone who knows how to keep it." Silas asked, very softly, "And who is that?" Grant shrugged. "Your family. Cyrus." And just like that, the final piece dropped into place. Silas nodded slowly, as if confirming the two-layer plan he'd suspected. Grant wanted to take the throne by turning Silas into an impulsive criminal. Cyrus wanted Silas gone entirely so he could claim the family power. Two men pretending to work together, really just using each other. And the child named Eli was their shared leverage. Grant expected Silas to deal with him right there at the table, because that was what Grant wanted, one act of violence to drag Silas down. But Silas didn't. He said one sentence, clear enough for the recorder to capture every syllable. "So you admit you were involved in twisting Harper's fund and clearing the path that night?" Grant blinked, realizing he'd said too much. He tried to pull back, but Miles moved half a step and blocked the door with his body, not threatening, only closing the exit. Grant stared at Silas, his voice suddenly sharp. "You set me up," Silas answered, calm to the point of cruelty. "I gave you a chance to tell the truth. You chose to speak." Grant's face went pale. In the next room, Holt logged it and prepared the paperwork. The switch was complete. No punch thrown, but a clean admission. And that would kill Grant faster than any fist ever could. Silas stood and looked at Grant one last time. "You aren't being dealt with by me," he said. "You're being dealt with by the truth." When Grant was taken out for Holt to do the law's part, Silas turned and saw Harper step in, her face asking without words whether it was over. Silas gave a very slight shake of his head, like delivering worse news. "Cyrus still has one more card," he said, voice low. "Travis." He looked toward the hallway where Eli was, and something flashed in his eyes, anger and worry braided together. And Eli. The news that Holt had Grant held under proper procedure hadn't even had time to spread before Cyrus made another move, fast and poisonous. The kind of move made by a man who understood that when the books get squeezed, flesh and bone get dragged in to replace them. Holt called Harper in the middle of the night, his voice blunt. "There are signs Travis is getting ready to act. Not media anymore. Real world." Harper looked at Eli sleeping in uneasy bursts on the sofa, one hand still gripping the corner of the blanket like he was afraid someone would pull him away in his dreams, and her heart tightened because she knew. If Cyrus couldn't take the ledger with money, he'd take it with a child's body. Silas stood by the window, watching the tree shadows, his back straight as a cut. "He'll take Eli before the court decides," Silas said, and it wasn't a prediction. It was the certainty of a man who'd lived through family moves like this. He has to create a new incident to force the court to lean. Harper nodded, eyes red from lack of sleep, voice hard anyway. "Then we don't chase. We set a trap." Holt agreed, and the plan was built not with guns, but with timing and authority. They couldn't keep Eli locked in the safe house forever without turning it into imprisonment, because that would become evidence against Harper. They needed a moment where Travis showed his intent on lawful camera, in front of witnesses, in a place where the law could actually touch him. Holt chose a public meeting spot that was bright enough, camera-heavy enough, and spaced enough that police could make an arrest without chaos. Harper hated using Eli as bait, but she understood the difference between being used and being protected was who held control. She sat beside Eli when he woke, keeping her voice gentle so she wouldn't crack him. "Eli, Travis might contact you," Harper said. "You don't have to answer. But if you want to hear him, I'll be here. I won't leave you alone." Eli looked at her, fear still in his eyes. But something new lived there too, a small, fragile trust. "He said he knows what happened to my mom," he whispered. Harper swallowed hard. "I know. And that's the bait." Eli flinched. Then his voice shrank to almost nothing. "But what if it's real?" Harper didn't lie. "If it's real, we'll hear it. But we'll hear it safely." Eli's phone buzzed in the morning, exactly as Holt had predicted. An unknown number. A short text that pressed straight into the wound like a finger on a button. "Want to know how your mother died? Come here. Alone." Eli read it and his hands started to shake, and the child part of him wanted to run out immediately, the way he'd run back toward that rainy staircase years ago to fix what couldn't be fixed. Harper set her hand over his wrist, warm and steady. "Look at me," she said. "You don't go alone." Eli shook his head, tears rising from anger at himself. "If I talk, they'll take you," he said. "They'll take him." Harper held his eyes. "They already took you once. You're still alive. Not because you're weak, but because someone didn't turn away. This time is the same." Holt placed people at a distance, out of uniform, to keep Travis from changing his mind. Silas didn't show up near the meeting point, because any hint of him would turn the story into Mafia intimidation. He stayed farther back in the dark, close enough that if everything broke, he could move, and far enough that he wouldn't contaminate the evidence. Eli went with Harper to the meeting point, a parking lot beside an all-night store, harsh white lights, a high-mounted camera turning steadily. Harper kept Eli close, not gripping him like a prisoner, only resting a hand on his shoulder like an anchor. Eli kept scanning, like a small bird waiting for a net. Then Travis appeared, and he wasn't alone. He came with another man half hidden, a phone raised like he was recording, exactly the look of someone performing and demanding rights at the same time. Travis walked up wearing perfect pain, voice soft. "Eli," he called, like calling a lost son. "Look at you. You're so thin." Eli didn't step forward. He stayed behind Harper, eyes wide. Harper spoke first, calm but cold. What do you want? Travis lifted both hands like an innocent man. I want to talk to my son. I want to bring him home. Harper didn't budge. Say it here. Say it now. Travis glanced around, saw the camera, saw the lights, saw everything that made a quick snatch difficult. He shifted tactics and lowered his voice, pulling out the hook. Eli, you want to know about your mother. Your father will tell you, but not in front of them. Eli jerked, eyes reddening. What do you know? Travis looked at Harper, then back to Eli, and a thin smile flickered like a crack in the mask. Your mother didn't die in an accident, he said, and the sentence hit Eli like a blow. Harper tightened her hand on Eli's shoulder, keeping him from lunging. What are you talking about? Travis tipped his head, pretending hurt. He wants the truth. He just needs to get in the car with his father. I'll tell him everything. It was the trap. From a distance, Holt signaled Harper to stretch it a few more lines to capture enough. Harper kept her voice steady and asked again, clear and slow, for the camera and microphone. You want Eli to get in your car? You're using information about his mother to lure him away. Yes. Travis smiled, sharper now. I'm his father. I have rights. Holt stepped out right then, voice carrying, badge shown but not waved. Travis Carter, you're under investigation for coercion and conspiracy to kidnap. Travis went pale, then immediately snapped back into performance, shouting that the police were bought, that the Mafia was controlling everything. The man half-hidden stepped forward as if to block. But Holt had his people. They appeared fast. No punching, no kicking, only clean restraint. Cuffs applied by procedure. Travis struggled, twisted toward Eli, and in real panic at being arrested, a piece of truth fell out of his mouth like broken glass. Your mother, Travis blurted, eyes red with rage and fear. She tried to call me that night, but I didn't come. Eli froze, like hearing rain again. Travis saw Eli go rigid, and the cruel smile returned. He cut the sentence on purpose and left it hanging like a hook. And the reason I didn't come was because... He stopped, looked at Harper, looked at Holt, then looked toward the far darkness like he knew someone was listening. Ask your Silas. He knows. Harper went cold, because it wasn't a strike aimed at truth. It was a strike aimed at a child's mind. Eli snapped like he'd been torn in half, looking at Harper, then toward the darkness where he knew Silas was. His voice broke open, no longer a whisper. Stop, Eli screamed, tears spilling. Stop doing this. He turned toward where Silas stood, even without seeing him clearly, and yelled with all the desperation of a child who'd spent his life believing he was the cause. I don't want anyone to die because of me. And far back in the shadows, Silas stood still, his fist clenched white, because that scream didn't just pull him to the edge. It woke the revenge in him, and this time Harper knew she'd have to hold him back with law, with love, and with the truth he'd sworn to find. Eli was brought back to the safe house after the in-the-act arrest, like a child who'd just been yanked off a rope and then thrown into silence again. And this time the silence wasn't shelter. It was a place where Travis's unfinished sentence kept knocking inside his skull, the way rain knocks on tin. Harper guided him into the small room beside the living room and closed the door, not locking it, only dulling the sharpness of the world outside. Eli took a few steps and stopped. His whole body was pulled tight like a string, eyes fixed on empty space. He didn't ask Harper anything. He didn't dare, because if he asked, the answer might break him for good. Harper held still for one beat and saw it. She understood that if she didn't pull the fuse now, the fire of guilt would burn Eli from the inside out, and it would burn Silas too, the man standing in the hallway like a pillar refusing to fall while the storm kept lashing. Harper went to the dresser and opened the drawer where she'd placed the crumpled envelope from the day before, the one Eli had touched, and then pulled away from like it was flame. She set the envelope on the table, pulled out a chair for Eli, then sat across from him, her voice neither so soft he'd feel pitied, nor so hard he'd feel judged. Eli, she said, some people use the truth like a whip. They lash it so you'll run after them. They leave a sentence unfinished so you can never rest. Eli swallowed, eyes red. He said my mom called him, he whispered. Then he said to ask Silas. Harper drew a deep breath. We won't let them control you with half a sentence anymore. She slid the envelope toward him. This is what you haven't been able to open. Do you want to open it? Eli stared at the envelope, his hand shaking. He shook his head by reflex, then gave a tiny nod that felt like asking for help. Harper didn't make him tear it open. She set her hand on the edge of the envelope and asked one last time with her eyes. And when Eli didn't pull away, Harper opened it slowly, like opening a door that could be pain and rescue at the same time. Inside wasn't money. It wasn't legal paperwork. It was a neatly folded sheet of paper, slanted handwriting, with spots blurred as if it had once gotten wet. Harper read the first line silently, and her eyes filled immediately, but she kept her voice steady, because right now she had to carry Eli across the bridge. "My son," Harper read, and Eli flinched like he'd heard his mother's voice calling him for real. Harper went on, laying each sentence down gently so it wouldn't shatter. Eli's mother wrote that she was sorry she couldn't give him a stable home, that she had tried, that she had loved him more than anything in the world. Then she wrote what mattered most, what Eli needed more than any secret adults tried to sell. She wrote that that night wasn't Eli's fault, that Eli hadn't killed anyone with a child's decision, that adult violence wasn't allowed to be placed on a child's shoulders. She wrote that if Eli was reading this letter, it meant someone had tried to use the truth to tie him up, and she left him one line, like a nail driven into the heart: "Don't let anyone use the truth as a whip." Harper reached that line and paused for one beat, because her voice wanted to break, but she forced it upright. Eli couldn't stay in the chair. He slid down to the floor, back against the table leg, both hands covering his head as if he was trying to keep the pieces from falling apart. And the sob broke out, not loud like screaming, but deep and choked, like something that had been trapped for years finally finding a way out. He cried like a real child, not the kind of child forced to play an adult. Harper didn't tell him not to cry. She didn't say it's okay in that empty way either. She only sat down beside him, placed a hand on his back, and let the letter do the rest. Eli gulped air, tears hot on his face, but inside that shaking sound, there was something new, something lighter, as if someone had lifted a stone off his chest. "I didn't kill my mom," he said through the choking, like he was testing a sentence he'd never allowed himself to believe. Harper bent closer, her voice rough. "No," she said, "you aren't to blame." Out in the hallway, Silas stayed still and didn't step inside, as if understanding this moment didn't need his power. It needed the truth of a mother. But when Eli's crying faded into silence, Harper lifted her head and saw Silas in the doorway, his shadow cutting across the light. He didn't come in deep. He didn't make it about himself. He only looked at Eli, the way you look at a child who survived a hell built by adults. Silas's voice was low, spare, boss-like, but this time it wasn't used to threaten anyone. It was used to build a wall. "From now on, no one touches you." Eli looked up, eyes red, and in Silas's gaze there was no pity, only a cold, steady promise. Harper had barely managed to breathe out when Tessa knocked and entered, her face tight. "Boss," Tessa said fast, "Cyrus disappeared. Our people lost him, and the secondary safe in the family office was opened." Silas didn't ask for useless detail. He asked the only thing that mattered. "The real ledger." Tessa nodded, her throat dry. "It's gone." In that moment, Harper saw Silas's eyes darken, not with blind rage, but with understanding. Cyrus had taken something that was both evidence and a key to power. And if he escaped with the real ledger, he would still have enough ammunition to shoot at the court, at the media, and at the heart of a child who had only just been released from guilt. Cyrus disappearing with the real ledger was like yanking your foot out of mud an instant before someone could grab your ankle, and the natural reflex of everyone around Silas was to surge into the night, to hunt with cars, with guns, with anger. But Silas stayed still in the office, the light sharpening the angles of his face until they looked even colder, and that calm made Harper afraid and trusting at the same time. "You're going to chase him," Harper said, not pushing, more like testing the boundary. Silas gave the smallest shake of his head. "Chasing is what he wants," he said. "He took the ledger to drag me into the street, to turn me into a violent story he can sell to the court." Holt stood near the door, listening like a man who'd watched too many cases collapse under emotion. "So what do you want?" Holt asked. Silas met his eyes. "I want him to expose his escape route. I want to handcuff him with paper." Holt understood immediately. "Evidence." Silas nodded. "Evidence instead of blood." Within hours they built a trap with no gunfire, only invisible fishing line. Tessa sent out a subtle false signal that Silas was furious, that he'd called people back from out of state, that he would take the ledger back with his own hands before dawn. That information didn't go out on a wide channel. It went only through the exact lines Cyrus could still hear, because Silas wanted Cyrus to believe time was on his side, that all he had to do was run faster to live. At the same time, Holt sought an emergency warrant from a judge based on what he already had: the threatening texts, location data, Travis's own statements during arrest, and most of all the implied admission Grant had made on a lawful recording earlier. Holt didn't call it a mafia war. He called it organized criminal conspiracy, money laundering, coercion of a minor, and conspiracy to commit murder. When the language is the law's, it cuts deeper than a knife. Silas supplied what Holt didn't have: maps of accounts, shell companies, cash points, and something even more valuable: Cyrus's habits. Cyrus couldn't vanish forever. He had to turn the ledger into a shield, or into money, or into a passport to step into safer territory. Silas didn't have to imagine where Cyrus would run. He knew by the books. He'll move it through 3 intermediary accounts before he leaves the country, Silas said, pointing at the screen. And he won't trust anyone except an old broker down at the port. Holt listened, then nodded. I'll put people there. Legally. Harper stood behind them, watching the way they turned darkness into paperwork. And she understood. This was the only way to keep Eli from being dragged into another spiral, because a bloody chase would only hand Travis and Cyrus a victory on television. That night, Cyrus truly believed Silas was chasing. He moved constantly, switching cars, switching phones, like a fox running through trees. He sent a few messages down old channels to test the air, and every time he did, he left warmth on the snow. Tessa received those small signals and didn't answer. She only logged them. Miles didn't rush in. He trailed at a distance like a shadow with patience and fed coordinates to Holt, so police could move one step ahead without Cyrus smelling them. Near dawn, Cyrus appeared in the parking lot of a warehouse by the port, where dirty yellow sodium lights made everything look like an old film. He didn't know a warrant had already been signed, and that every exit had someone waiting inside an unmarked car. Cyrus stepped out with a slim leather case in his hand, posture still straight like a man who'd never lost, because in his head, Silas would show up any second. Angry, out of control, right on script. He wanted Silas to appear. He wanted cameras. He wanted a punch. But instead of Silas, Holt stepped out of the dark, badge raised, voice clear and dry. Cyrus Rourke, you're under arrest for conspiracy to launder money and conspiracy to commit murder. Cyrus froze for one beat, then gave a soft laugh like he'd heard a joke. Detective, he said, are you sure? I'm only an uncle worried about family. Holt didn't answer the sneer. He signaled, and 2 officers moved in and cuffed Cyrus by the book. Cyrus didn't fight. He only looked around as if still waiting for Silas to burst out. And Silas truly was there, but farther back in the shadows, not stepping into the light, as if he'd decided not to give Cyrus what he wanted. Cyrus caught that silhouette in a reflection on a car window, and his eyes narrowed. You're there, he called out, loud enough for Silas to hear. You can't even look at me. Silas didn't step forward. Holt opened the case, removed the ledger, and sealed it. Cyrus curled his lip. You think getting that is the end, Holt answered, and this time there was a faint edge. Not just that. He held up his phone and played an authenticated audio sequence, stitched and verified by proper procedure. Cyrus's voice filled the air, talking with Grant about clearing the path, talking with Travis about how to push the media, about using the child to force Silas off the board. Not one isolated clip, a chain. Cyrus, Grant, Travis, connected into one straight line that couldn't be denied, guilt locked in by their own mouths. Cyrus listened for a few seconds, then gave a dismissive laugh, but the laugh had lost the confidence of a man standing outside the law. He was pushed into the car, cuffs clicking, and before the door shut he turned his head, eyes searching for Silas's shadow like he was throwing a final curse. You think you won, Cyrus said, his voice still smooth but poisonous. The Rourke name will pull you under. The car door slammed, and in the darkness Silas didn't chase, didn't explode, only stood still like a man who'd ended a war with paperwork, and yet knew the name Rourke was still a long shadow, and that shadow could return at any time if he didn't protect a child from the whips that wore the name of truth. The final decision hearing came faster than Eli expected, as if the whole world had been waiting to place him on the scale one more time. On the drive to court, Eli sat in the back seat between Harper and Silas, his fingers laced together until they turned white. his eyes fixed on the window without truly seeing anything except colors sliding past. Harper didn't say much. Now and then she touched the back of his hand, a quiet reminder that he wasn't being left behind. Silas sat behind them, not leaning back, his posture still like a man always ready to rise if anything threatened. But today he tried to make himself smaller, as if he'd learned that in a courtroom, the right silence could protect a child better than any speech. In the courthouse hallway, the click of shoes, the low murmur of voices, the flip of paperwork all hit Eli's ears like rain from an old night. He remembered what Cyrus had said about the Rourke name, remembered the way Travis had tried to leave sentences unfinished to drive him mad, and he felt fear, not fear of being hit, but fear of being pulled away from Harper, away from the first warm seat he'd ever dared to sit in without worrying he'd be thrown out. When they entered the courtroom, the atmosphere was different from last time. Holt was there, tired but solid. Tessa and Miles sat behind, silent as shadows. Travis Carter was there too, but he no longer wore the confident victim face he'd used for cameras. He kept scanning the room, lips pressed tight, because now the table held more than a story. It held evidence. The judge entered with a direct, unsparing look, and stated that the court would review the entire updated file, the arrest warrants, the recorded audio, the text messages, and the reports related to the child's safety. Holt presented his case cleanly in legal language, that Cyrus Rourke had been arrested and charged with serious offenses tied to money laundering and conspiracy to commit murder, that Grant Harlow had been detained and was facing prosecution for his role in a chain of coercion and kidnapping, that Travis Carter had been arrested in the act while attempting to lure Eli away from supervision and had engaged in threats and coercion using information about Eli's mother. Travis's attorney tried to argue back, saying his client only wanted to see his son, that everything had been misunderstood because the Rourke name was too big. But this time, the judge didn't look at the name. The judge looked at the chain, the threatening texts sent to Eli, the unfinished sentences used to torment him, the attempt to force Eli into a car, and the fact that Travis knew internal details about the safe house. Together, it formed a picture that couldn't be called fatherhood. The judge issued a temporary no-contact order against Travis, emphasizing that parental rights on paper didn't permit threatening behavior. When Eli heard the words no contact, his heart felt lighter and it hurt at the same time, because even when a father is terrible, the word father still casts a shadow. Harper didn't turn to say anything. She only let out a slow breath, like someone who'd been holding a door shut with her own body. The judge continued, stating that Cyrus and Grant were being prosecuted, that the court would weigh stability, safety, and Eli's best interests for the long term, not just a few loud days of media noise. When the judge spoke about a stable environment, Harper's attorney presented evidence of care, that Eli had been fed and allowed to sleep, given basic medical checks, offered emotional support, and most importantly, not imprisoned, not forced into anything, that Harper had met Eli's basic and emotional needs while authorities handled the threat. Even so, the word stable still hung like a blade, because Eli looked around and understood, courts don't love complexity. Courts prefer simple stories, and his life had never been simple. Eli started to tremble. He heard the judge talking, heard his own name, but inside his head only one sentence remained. If they take me from Harper, I'll go back to the street. I'll be a thing passed hand to hand again. He tugged at his sleeve, as if he could disappear. Harper saw it immediately. She leaned close and whispered into his ear, not sweet, but steady. Look at me. Eli turned, eyes red. Harper said the sentence she'd been holding for the right moment, like opening a second door after his mother's letter. You don't need permission to be loved. It struck straight into the poisonous belief Eli had carried since the rainy night, that he had to earn the right to stay. Eli bit his lip, tears rising, but he forced them down because they were in court. Silas stood behind Harper and Eli, not stepping forward, not speaking at length. He only placed a hand on Eli's shoulder, very lightly, a rare touch for a man like Silas, but enough for Eli to feel a wall at his back, not a wall to hide crime, but a wall against the wind. The judge turned a few more pages, stayed silent for a long moment, then looked up, eyes settling on Eli as if seeing a person and not a file. The whole room seemed to stop when the judge said his name. Eli Carter, the judge said, neither cold nor soft. What would you like to say before the court decides? The courtroom was so silent Eli could hear his own heartbeat when the judge spoke his name. He stood up, knees shaking but not giving out, because this time he wasn't standing alone. Harper was on his left. Silas was behind him, his hand still resting lightly on Eli's shoulder, an anchor that didn't need to show off. Eli swallowed hard and looked straight ahead, not at Travis, not searching for anyone's eyes. "I don't need money," he said, his voice not loud but clear. "I don't need a big house. I need to be safe. I need someone who keeps their word." He paused, as if weighing each word. "I don't want to be used so someone else can win. I just want to live somewhere no one makes me choose between staying alive and running." No one in the room cut him off. The judge watched Eli for a long moment, then looked at Harper, looked at Silas, looked at Holt, and finally looked at Travis. There was no booming gavel, only a decision spoken in an even, steady voice. Temporary custody was granted to Harper Lane Rourke, while the legal adoption process moved forward according to procedure. Travis Carter was ordered to have no contact with Eli until psychological evaluation and investigation were completed. The allegations related to coercion and threats would continue to be handled under the law. Cyrus Rourke and Grant Harlow would face prosecution based on the evidence collected, from lawful recordings to money trails and a conspiracy linked into a complete chain. There was no cheering, only a long breath leaving the chest of a child who had finally been set down on solid ground. Eli didn't cry in the courtroom. He only turned to Harper, as if to make sure he hadn't misheard. Harper smiled, not bright, but warm and real. Silas didn't speak a victory speech. He only gave the smallest nod, like a man who had finished a promise. In the days that followed, nothing turned into a fairy tale overnight. The press kept talking. The Rourke name remained a long shadow. But the difference now was paper, law, a clear decision standing on the side of a child. Grant was convicted on clean evidence, not a single punch thrown, only a chain of truth placed where it belonged. Cyrus lost family power and was forced to face what he had plotted. Travis was barred from contact and made to answer for words he had used like a whip. And one morning, with no sirens, no threatening texts, Eli stood at the door of the safe house he had once climbed out of through a window to escape. This time, the door opened by Harper's hand, and he walked in through the front. No running, no looking back to see if anyone was chasing him. The light inside the house didn't scare him anymore. It was only light. Silas stood in the entryway, not in an expensive suit, only a simple shirt, but his eyes still held the cold of a man who didn't forget what had happened. When Eli crossed the threshold, Silas said one sentence, his voice low but not hard. "Your family here. No one gets to make you afraid." It wasn't a sweet promise. It was a rule. And this time, Eli believed it. The story closed not with a gunshot, but with a door opened the right way. The lesson wasn't about who was stronger. It was about who was brave enough to choose truth instead of revenge, to choose law instead of rage, to choose protecting a child instead of using him as a weapon. Sometimes family isn't where you're born. It's where people keep their word to you when everything else is shaking. If this story touched your heart, tell us how you feel in the comments. What do you think about Eli's choice? About the way Harper and Silas stood on the side of truth instead of violence? Did this story connect to anything in your real life? Don't forget to subscribe to our channel so you won't miss emotional, deeply human stories every day. Please like and share this video if you believe every child deserves to be safe and to be loved the right way. Thank you for staying with us to the end of this journey. We can't wait to hear what's deep in your heart. Goodbye, and we'll see you in the next video. Wishing everyone watching good health, a joyful life, and peaceful days.